The Western media has dubbed it the Great Reassurance Tour, a trip to reassure Washington's allies in the region that its strategic pivot to Asia isn't all talk. The president landed in Japan this week to meet with his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We're joined now by our White House correspondent, Jessica Stone, to get the latest on Obama's visit. And Jessica, as we've been reporting, the president has been in Japan, the first stop. What's he been doing there?
Well, this was the first state visit that a U.S. president had been on to Japan since 1996, so a long time coming. It included a bilateral meeting and press conference, as well as several ceremonial visits to shrines and meetings with the Imperial Palace Emperor and Empress.
Well, as you point out, a lot of the what he's been doing there has been ceremonial, have been symbolic, but there must have been some substantive issues that he discussed.
Very substantive, and of course they were kicked off with this White House release on Monday of answers to questions in the biggest newspaper in all of Japan, to a series of questions to Yomiuri Shimbun, the major newspaper there, about things like the territorial disputes with China, about TPP, about Okinawa and Futenma and the U.S. Marines there. So there were a lot of issues touched on in that interview that was released just as Obama hit the ground, literally. And chief among them, of course, is this ongoing dispute with China. And the way that the U.S. president responded to that question was to reaffirm the military alliance between U.S.-Japan and say that it applies to the territorial lands that Japan currently has under its administration.
Well, looking at that reaffirmation that you talk about, the United States has security treaties with 3 of the 4 countries he'll be visiting, with the Philippines, with Japan, and with South Korea. Are these countries in any way worried about the U.S. commitment to their security when one looks at the way in which the president has handled, say, issues in Syria? I mean, you remember he drew that red line, then he walked away from it. Or what has been somewhat of a lukewarm response to what Russia has been doing in Ukraine?
Well, and of course, it's coming at a time when the ongoing issues with Ukraine and Russia are a backdrop in many ways. There were questions at the presidential press conference about what's going on there, the U.S. handling of it, this sort of constant threat of sanctions, but no real evidence that Russia is responding to those sanctions in terms of drawing back from Ukraine. But I think it is fair to say that especially U.S. allies are concerned not only by the diplomacy and the way the Obama White House is working on these issues and these red lines, but also by the military drawdown that's been announced, this sequester spending and the military cuts that will affect, the Pentagon says, the Asia-Pacific and the numbers of naval fleets that can be on patrol, which really becomes very important when you talk about these territorial disputes. Part of what U.S. naval presence does in those areas is maintain international shipping lanes, freedom of navigation, and these countries in the region, even if they have their own navies, are depending on the U.S. to do that.
So the president makes all these reassurances, telling the allies, we will stand by you, saying that in one instance we are duty-bound to protect Japan through our bilateral treaty if there is any kind of conflict. Has there been any kind of response from China to this?
There absolutely has. China was very quick to respond, in fact, and basically said, look, we have said from the beginning that the Diaoyu Islands are sovereign territory of China and that the U.S. needs to mind its own. We're very firm yesterday during a press conference. Let's have a listen.
The so-called control of the islands by the Japanese side is illegal and invalid. Their provocative actions are undeniable and unjustifiable. Our determination and resolve to safeguard territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests is unshakable. The U.S. should respect facts, act responsibly, stick to its commitment of taking no sides in relevant territorial disputes, think twice before saying or doing anything, and truly play a constructive role in ensuring regional peace and stability.
So you can hear from that soundbite just the strength with which the Chinese Foreign Ministry is coming out on this issue, and that was just in response to what was printed in the Yomiuri Shimbun news article. Of course, that was then reiterated by the U.S. president in a press conference with Shinzo Abe, but it was couched in the context of asking Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who has a very nationalistic agenda, to tone down the rhetoric, some of the rhetoric and the visits, for example, to the Yasukuni Shrine, which are very offensive to the Chinese people. Things of that nature, it would appear, Obama is quietly and a little bit publicly suggesting to his counterpart are not in the best interest of peace in the region.
Right, Jessica, let's turn away from security issues for a moment to trade. The big issue, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP as it's known. There's been a lot of disputes between the United States and Japan over getting agreement on this. The negotiations have been taking place for a long time. There have been a number of sessions. They're squabbling right now over certain commodities, etc. There's no agreement. We heard that there will be no agreement on this. The can's been kicked down the road. Is that something of a setback?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. When you talk here in Washington to trade experts, they would say these agreements can take years, almost a decade to negotiate. And it was clear from the way both Abe and Obama handled the questions at the press conference on Thursday that they believe that they have made some progress. They're leaving their trade negotiators to continue the talks during the visit and for several days afterwards. But there's going to be a back and forth, especially in the areas of access to Japan's agricultural and automobile sector.
Okay, let's move on to the rest of the visit. The president now in South Korea. He's also going to be visiting Philippines and Malaysia. What are the expectations in these countries?
Well, the Korea visit is very much a security visit. There's going to be a lot of talk, of course, about the DPRK, about the six-party talks, about China's role in those talks, and how the six parties can get the DPRK to denuclearize. President Obama has been very clear. He has very low expectations, but just wants to keep plugging away. And the Korean people need to hear from him about that. The same with the Philippines. That's also a very security-focused visit. Of course, the U.S. president will make remarks to Filipino service members during that stop. And also, actually, I believe, tour an electric vehicle. So there is a little bit of a component of economic development there. And then in Malaysia, this is the first visit by a U.S. president since 1966. So it is historic. It's going to be a state visit. He's going to be meeting with Prime Minister Najib Razak about entrepreneurship and also about the TPP, which is something that Malaysia has joined. Of course, it's going to have a very long way to go to meet some of the expectations under that trade agreement.
One quick question, Jessica, and this is something which came up just a day or two ago. The president was taken to a restaurant, a sushi restaurant, apparently serves the best sushi in the world. Did he say anything about that?
Well, that was actually the headlines of some of the Japanese press, was just how much he enjoyed it and how he expressed that. He didn't talk a lot about it in the press conference today, but he did talk about really, enjoying having the treat of something so special and something so Japanese. But I think we'll probably get to ask him a little bit about that when he comes back to the White House.